There's a moment no one talks about. Not the loud breakdown, not the visible tears, not the night you finally screamed into your pillow. No, this moment is quieter, more dangerous. It's the morning you wake up and realize you feel nothing. Not anger, not joy, not even fear, just stillness. Like the world is a stage and you're the only actor who forgot their lines. You go through the motions, smile at the barista, nod at your boss. Say I'm good when someone asks how you're doing. But inside something is dissolving. Something is cracking under the weight of a performance you never agreed to audition for. You begin to wonder, is this what depression feels like, or is it something else? Because this doesn't feel like illness. It feels like truth, one that you've buried so deeply for so long. It now rises like smoke from the wreckage. You weren't always this way. Once you tried. You tried to be good, to be kind, to fit in. You smiled when they said something hurtful. You complied when your boundaries were pushed. You stayed quiet so you wouldn't seem difficult. You performed the role of the well-adjusted person so well they all clapped. But now the applause is gone and the silence is unbearable. Because deep down a whisper keeps repeating itself. What if the life you built was never really yours? That question haunts you not because it's painful, but because it might be true. The career, the relationship, the identity. You start to see cracks in the reality you were handed. Not just cracks, fault lines. And when those fault lines shift, when the mask begins to slip, they don't call it awakening. They call it depression. But what if that label is wrong? What if this ache in your chest, this urge to withdraw, this disinterest in superficial pleasures, is not sickness, but a sacred signal? What if you're not broken, you're simply waking up from the illusion that productivity is purpose, that obedience is virtue, that smiling through suffering is strength, that you should be grateful for a life that doesn't even feel like yours. What you feel right now isn't failure. It's the friction between who you are and who you were trained to be. And that friction burns. It burns so much they'll say you're depressed. They'll urge you to get help so you can return to the dream. But something in you knows you're not going back. You're not depressed. You're waking up, and that is terrifying. But it's also the beginning. From the moment you were old enough to speak, they began the download. Not maliciously, not even consciously. But they handed you a script, a blueprint for a good life. And they smiled while doing it. They said, work hard, succeed, smile, don't question too much. They told you pain means you're weak, that happiness is a choice, and that if you're not smiling, you're broken. They fed you sugar-coated mantras wrapped in polite expectations. Be grateful. Be nice. Stay busy. But here's the poison they didn't mention. In following their script, you disconnected from your soul. You began to wear emotions like uniforms, a happy face at work, a polite nod in family gatherings, a neutral tone in conflict. Because you learned early that authenticity was inconvenient, that crying made others uncomfortable, that anger made you difficult, that silence made you strange. And so, like millions around you, you traded your truth for approval. This is the sickness no one talks about. Likability conditioning. You weren't trained to be whole. You were trained to be pleasant. And it worked. You became likable, approachable, easy to digest, but not seen, not felt, not real. They told you warmth was everything. Be kind, be generous, be open. But they never warned you about the trade-off. The more warmth you offer in a cold world, the more invisible you become. They never told you that in many systems, especially corporate, romantic, even familial warmth, is mistaken for weakness. That people trust competence over kindness. That niceness is exploited, not rewarded. This is the warmth versus competence paradox, and it leaves good people burning out in silence. Then comes the availability bias, the illusion that if you're always there, always responsive, always agreeable, you're less valuable. That you become background noise. And worst of all, you internalize it. You start treating yourself the way the world does. You silence your voice. You numb your needs. You fake the smile. And then you wonder why you feel empty. But here's the truth. You trained the world to treat you as ordinary because you were programmed to believe your real self was too much, too angry, too sad, too confusing. So now when you finally stop pretending, they say, you've changed. You're depressed. But no, this isn't dysfunction. This is the first time in your life you're not performing. And that scares people. Because when you wake up, you force them to confront the lie they're still sleeping in. In every system, whether family, work, or love, there's a currency. Sometimes it's money, but more often it's emotion, affection, attention, validation. We trade them every day, consciously or not. And in that emotional marketplace, those who need less hold more power. That's the brutal truth no one wants to say out loud. Because it means the more you crave approval, the less valuable your presence becomes. If you give affection freely without boundary, without price, the world will assume it's cheap. If you're always available, they'll stop checking if you're okay. If you never say no, they'll forget you have a choice. You're not being punished for feeling. You're just playing a game that rewards distance more than depth. Because this system doesn't care how kind you are. It only respects what it can't control. That's why you keep losing to the cold ones. The ones who withhold, who don't answer right away, who seem emotionally untouchable. They appear strong not because they are better, but because they're harder to reach. We live in a culture that mistakes needlessness for strength. The less you ask for, the more they lean in. The colder you become, the more curious they grow. It's twisted, but it's real. And if you've been the warm one your whole life, the one who checks in, who forgives, who tries again, you've probably noticed. No one values what they assume is always there. This doesn't mean love should be a weapon, but it does mean your emotional availability should be deliberate, not automatic. Because the moment you start handing out your energy like candy, you're not being generous. You're being depleted. As Nietzsche once said, "He who needs less holds the power." And until you stop emotionally overextending, you'll keep bleeding quietly in relationships where the coldest person always wins. So ask yourself, is your kindness a choice or a habit of survival? If it's the latter, then maybe your depression isn't a symptom, it's a signal that you've been giving too much to a world that's forgotten how to give back. There's a moment when everything breaks, but no one sees it happen. Because it's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's not something you post about online. It's the quiet collapse. The morning you stop setting your alarm because nothing feels urgent anymore. The night you stare at the ceiling and wonder, is this it? The phone buzzing with messages you don't care to answer. The coffee gone cold because you forgot to drink it again. They call it laziness. They call it burnout. Some even say it's just a phase, but you know it's something else. It's the death of a persona. The mask is cracking, and underneath it you don't know who you are anymore. And that's terrifying, because for years you measured your worth by your usefulness. You found meaning in being productive, agreeable, consistent. You were the reliable one, the strong one, the calm one. But now even brushing your teeth feels like a negotiation. Even responding to a "How are you?" feels dishonest. You're not falling apart because you're weak. You're falling apart because the script you were handed no longer works. And deep down, you know it never did. What they labeled depression is often just the soul's protest against a life built on performance. This collapse isn't dysfunction. It's the natural consequence of living in contradiction for too long. You've smiled while dying inside. You've said yes when you meant no. You've kept peace by betraying yourself. And now the debt is due. As Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But to claim that privilege, something has to die first. The obedient version of you. The pleasing version of you. The version that believed staying small was safe. So yes, this collapse feels like death. But what's actually dying is the illusion that you had to be someone else to be loved. And in that death there is something sacred. Because what follows isn't darkness. It's truth. The kind that doesn't need to scream. The kind that whispers, "You're still here." And you're finally ready to meet yourself. When everything falls apart, something else begins. Not immediately, not loudly, but subtly, like a faint pulse under the wreckage. At first, it feels like nothing. You just stop pretending. You stop forcing conversations. Stop chasing the people who never saw you. You cancel plans not out of spite, but because your nervous system finally says, no more. You're not social. You're not antisocial. You're simply exhausted from playing roles that never fit you. And in that stillness, something strange happens, clarity. You start seeing people for who they are, not who you hoped they would be. You notice how certain environments make you shrink. You feel how your body tightens around falsehood. You begin to crave solitude, not to escape, but to finally hear your own voice again. This isn't depression, it's awakening. You realize the things you thought were normal were actually cages. That saying "I'm fine" all the time wasn't health, it was survival. That productivity was your drug because stillness made you confront yourself. And now the mask has dropped. There's no going back. Because once you've tasted, even a drop of truth, illusion becomes unbearable. And what is this truth? That much of what you were told to chase, success, image, validation, was never about you. It was about control. It was about compliance. You were trained to adapt to a system that never asked who you truly were. And for a long time you adjusted perfectly to that sickness. But as Krishnamurti said, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Now you've stopped adjusting, and they call it depression. But what they're really seeing is someone no longer willing to play along. You've entered a different frequency, quieter, slower, more honest, where silence isn't empty, it's full of answers. You begin rebuilding not your career or your relationships, but your center, your presence, your right to say no without guilt, to sit with sadness without fixing it, to want less but feel more. And yes, this makes you harder to relate to. You no longer laugh at things that aren't funny. You don't rush to fill awkward silences. You're not interested in impressing anyone, because now you know your peace is not negotiable. You used to seek permission to rest. Now you simply rest. You used to explain your feelings. Now you let them be. You used to fear loneliness. Now you understand that being alone and being at peace are often the same thing. This is the shift. It doesn't make you special. It makes you real. And in a world addicted to illusion, real is the most radical thing you can be. At some point in your awakening, you begin to detach, not out of bitterness, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Because you realize you can't keep bleeding for a world that never learned how to stop cutting. So you pull back. Not because you've stopped caring, but because you've finally started caring about yourself. This is emotional detachment, but not the kind they fear, not the cruel, silent treatment born from ego. This is detachment born from clarity, from boundaries, from peace. You're not shutting people out. You're shutting out the noise, the guilt, the manipulation dressed as care, the obligations that were never yours. You no longer argue to be understood. You no longer chase to be chosen. You no longer sacrifice presence for performance, because now you understand something they never taught you. Your energy is sacred, and if you give it to everyone, you have nothing left for yourself. Emotional detachment is not about not feeling. It's about choosing where and how deeply you feel. It's the discipline to let others be wrong about you, to watch a text go unanswered, to walk away from dysfunction without explaining your worth. You used to think silence was punishment. Now you know it's protection. You used to confuse being needed with being loved. Now you know true love doesn't drain you, it grounds you. They may say you've become cold, but that's only because they can no longer access what they used to consume freely. As the Stoics understood, control over emotion is not suppression, it's sovereignty. You are not numbing, you are not escaping, you are choosing, and that choice is the birth of self-respect. So no, you haven't changed. You've just returned to yourself, the version that doesn't need to be loud to be strong, the version that doesn't need to react to prove its presence. You're not distant. You're just no longer available to everything that breaks you. And in that space, you begin to heal. When you begin to withdraw, the world notices. Not immediately. At first, they enjoy the silence. They mistake your distance for compliance. They think, good. He's calmed down. But then something unexpected happens. They feel your absence. Because you used to fill the space emotionally, mentally, energetically. You used to carry conversations, soothe tempers, offer reassurances, show up even when you were breaking. Now you don't. And they don't know what to do with the void. They accuse you of being cold, distant, unavailable. But what they're really saying is, I can no longer access you on demand. Your emotional detachment has disrupted the pattern. You're not playing the role anymore. You've exited the script, and suddenly they're left alone with their own emptiness. Because what they miss isn't really you. They miss the version of you that was easy to consume. The man who said yes when he wanted to say no. The man who made everyone else feel comfortable at the cost of his own peace. The man who stayed just a little too long in places that drained him. He's gone. And in his place is someone they can't predict. Someone they can't guilt, someone who responds with silence instead of justification. And silence is louder than any scream. Your absence starts echoing louder than your presence ever did. They feel it in delayed replies, in your lack of interest, in the way you walk away from chaos without flinching. You've become an emotional mirror reflecting their behavior back at them with no sugarcoating. And not everyone can handle that. Some will leave. Some will lash out. Some will try to drag you back into the old dance. But the real ones, they'll adjust. They'll learn your new rhythm. They'll rise to meet your silence with respect, not resistance. Because coldness, when rooted in clarity, is not cruelty. It's correction. It's a reminder that you are not here to be consumed. That your warmth is a gift, not a guarantee. That your time is earned, not owed. And most of all, that your peace is no longer up for negotiation. So yes, your coldness will have consequences, but none greater than this. For the first time in your life, you're not just protecting your boundaries, you're honoring your soul. At the end of this unraveling, beyond the exhaustion, the silence, the detachment, a simple truth emerges. You're not depressed. You're waking up from lies, from roles, from the invisible chains that once told you who to be. You see it now. The smile you wore wasn't peace, it was performance. The life you built wasn't freedom, it was obedience. And the pain you felt, that wasn't dysfunction. That was your soul banging against the cage, begging you to listen. This world taught you that coldness is a flaw, that silence is a weakness, that walking away makes you heartless. But now you know coldness is clarity. Silence is strength. Distance is a form of dignity. You don't become cold to hurt others. You become cold because warmth was used against you. You become still because movement became meaningless. You become hard to reach because your soul deserves to be protected. This isn't regression. It's liberation, a shedding of illusions so complete that what once thrilled you now looks plastic. The relationships you begged to keep now feel foreign. The environments you once feared losing now feel unworthy of your presence. You've changed, but not into someone else. You've returned to someone real, and that realness is no longer interested in being liked, only in being whole. As Nietzsche wrote, "The man who stands alone is always feared because his power comes from within." That's you now, not angry, not broken, not even sad, just awake. And while this awakening may feel like loneliness, know this: you're not alone. You're just ahead. Welcome back.